So as you know, the reason why Lent is 40 days is because it corresponds with the time that Jesus spent in the desert being tempted by the devil. And obviously, the preeminent story which describes Jesus' experience in this regard is found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4, the temptation of Jesus in the desert. Now, obviously, if you're spending 40 days alone in the desert, you're going to be pretty hungry, to say the least. And so the devil knows this, and so therefore the first temptation is framed around the desire for bread. So what he says to the Lord is like, look, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. Now, it's kind of interesting what the Lord says in response, right? And so he doesn't deny that we are corporal beings who are in need of food, water, shelter, that sort of thing, right? And so he doesn't say that we don't need bread, but instead what he says is man is not meant to live on bread alone. It alludes to the fact that we are corporal beings, both body and spirit. And so, yes, as corporal beings, we have physical needs. We need bread. We have a need for food and shelter and water, that sort of thing. But at the same time, again, we are corporal beings, and so we are body and soul. And more to the point, we got to recognize that that which affects the body very much affects the soul. And if we're not mindful of that, we make all sorts of mistakes individually and collectively as a society. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember talking to a friend of mine back in the day who is a really smart guy, but is not Catholic. He's not religious in any sense. And basically he was asking me to explain what's wrong with premarital sex. And I remember him saying to me something like, don't give me Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so basically what I said to him was this: what we do with our bodies has meaning, whether we recognize it or not. And so a handshake, for example, conveys friendship. A high five means the local sports team won. And when it comes to the sexual act, what does the sexual act or the marital act actually convey? It conveys the fact that I give to you wholly and entirely and permanently my true self, my full self, without holding back, without reservation, in a way which is open to life. And the whole point, of course, is that that situation is only true when it comes to a marriage between a man and a woman where the couple, as they engage in the act, are open to life. Which speaks to the fact that ultimately, if there's a disconnect between what you're saying with your body and the actual lived out reality, well then basically you're living a lie. It's like shaking someone's hand as you're punching them in the face. So again, whether or not you recognize the disconnect consciously, your body knows better. And you can never have real, authentic peace of heart because you lack integrity, which is a really important prerequisite for having, again, peace of heart, the happiness that you long for. Now, at the end of this, my friend kind of paused, like we were talking on the phone. And then, to my surprise, he said, that kind of makes sense. And he went on to describe this experience that he had with his ex-girlfriend. And so, just to kind of paraphrase, what he said was that in terms of sexual experience, even though he had been around the block, she had been around the neighborhood. And he always felt, even prior to this particular conversation we were having here, that that's a big reason why they couldn't really be together in the way that they both wanted. And so the way he framed it was that, because of his past experience, he felt that she could never really give herself to him in the way that he wanted, in the way that she wanted. As a result of which, even when they were together, they were always a little bit dissatisfied, until, of course, they eventually broke up. In any case, the second temptation the devil poses to the Lord has to do with power and glory. So basically what he says to him is like, look, I will give you all sorts of power and glory if you will but fall to your knees and worship me. In response to which Jesus basically says, you're called to worship God and God alone. Now this particular part of the story speaks to the fact that there's always this recurring temptation on the part of the people of God, individually and collectively, to replace God, if you will, in their hearts with the classical substitutes for his divine presence, whether we're talking about wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. But that said, the thing I want to impress upon you is that it's one thing to be aware of this particular temptation, it's another thing to live it out, right? Because we're not simply talking about, being sure that you go to Mass, even though that's obviously a really important thing. It's a matter of being in right relationship with God. And the whole point is that the moment I forget who God is, and in particular the moment I forget the primacy of God and everything that implies, that's the moment I lose my sense of self. I forget who I am, I forget what life is about, I forget what I'm called to do, as a result of which I feel empty, sad, and lost. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember back in the day when I was at St. Augustine Seminary studying to be a priest, I was on the social committee, right? And so we were in charge of organizing parties for building fraternity and that sort of thing. And I remember for one particular social, basically we designed this amazing social built around Chinese New Year, right? And so we had dim sum cards, we had a noodle station, we had things playing on different TVs showing scenes from different Asian films. It was really awesome and really well thought out, really well received. Everything seemed to be going great. But then I remember afterwards kind of going to the chapel and reviewing the past day, reviewing the past 24 hours, including the social, which again was planned to the hilt, was executed well, and was received well. And all of a sudden, I found myself kind of bursting into tears. There was nothing wrong with the social per se, right? It was good that we did it. It was good that it was executed well. The problem was my level of attachment to the success of that social. Somewhere along the way, I had somehow convinced myself that I was the guy who put on really good socials. Like, that's who I am at the core. Somewhere along the way, I had become completely lost in that regard. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I am fundamentally a child of God, beloved by my Father in heaven, no more and no less. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, the moment I start to build my sense of identity around, again, wealth, pleasure, power, and honor, that doesn't make me strong, it makes me weak. And so I made sort of a promise, if not a solemn vow to the Lord, that going forward, I would try my best, try my very best to make sure that never happened ever again. Now that brings us to the third and final temptation that you find in the story. And so basically the way the devil frames it is like, look, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself off this cliff, and basically the angels will catch you. In response to which Jesus says, you must not put the Lord your God to the test. Now obviously the particular wording of this temptation is something you find up and down, not just the Bible, but in life. How often do we say to the Lord some variation of like, look, if you cared, if you really are God, you would do this, you would do that, you would make my life predictable, you would make my life safe, you would remove any aspect of the cross, you would fulfill my expectations for how life is supposed to be as opposed to how you want it to be. Whereas in reality what we're called to do is to adopt that particular advice that is always given to the people of God by the Lord himself whenever they are freaking out. Some variation of like, be still and know that I am God. And so you see this advice being spoken to the people of God in the Old Testament when they're with the prophet Moses by the Red Sea. You find this spoken to the disciples when they're afraid and lost in that boat. And what's being implied here is like, look, even though there might be reasons why you might be inclined to freak out, whether we're talking about the sound of the wind or the splash of water in your face, or whatever the case may be, you need to remember always that I remain Lord, even now, especially now. And so therefore, based on the fact alone that I am the Lord and I love you, and nothing can separate you from me, you should have peace in the midst of storms, despite what you're experiencing, despite what you're feeling internally. Okay, one final example, I'll kind of end with this. So recently I was listening to a podcast where basically the guest speaker was talking about the notion of peace. And so just to kind of paraphrase, what he said was that when he was praying as an adult, as a father of many children, it occurred to him that the Lord wanted him to pursue peace. And reflecting on that particular insight, he thought, you know what? There was a time when I was young when I knew that. I knew that where peace was, there God was also. And so therefore, because I had a certain clarity about the importance and goodness and sacredness of peace, I didn't just look for it, I actively pursued it. But then as I got older, I kind of forgot about it. I kind of put the pursuit of peace to the wayside because I convinced myself I had more important things to focus on, more important things to do. But again, here was the Lord Jesus Christ, who was reminding me about the importance and primacy of not just recognizing peace, but actively pursuing it. For myself, I gotta be honest, I started applying that principle to myself almost immediately. And in particular, I started asking myself the question, what are the things that threaten to take away from my peace? And to my surprise, it wasn't like tangible stuff, but rather it was a sense of possessiveness, a sense of undue attachment. Whenever I insist that life has to play out a certain way, or I start to question God's providence because things aren't meeting my expectations, that's when I start to lose my peace. And so therefore, what do I have to do? What do we have to do to protect and safeguard our peace, never mind actively pursue it? We need to go the way of trusting, letting go, accepting, that type of thing, as opposed to going the way of clinging, possessing, controlling, or having. And so at the end of the day, it's more an attitude of receptivity as opposed to grasping. But you know, friends, this particular dynamic really drives home this experience and insight I've been realizing more and more myself the longer I've been Catholic and the longer I've been a priest. Namely, this idea that the gospel is a lot easier than we might make it out to be. Rather than go the way of trying to build a spiritual rocket ship or solve a complex spiritual algorithm to reach the heights of heaven, we got to realize that, no, our hearts are made to receive the gift. And the Lord is very much a cheerful giver. He wills for us to be transformed by the grace He constantly showers upon us. And so therefore, how are we called to cooperate with this massive and constant influx of grace? Again, not by clinging or possessing or controlling or having, but by letting go. Trusting and believing that, again, our hearts are made to receive the fullness of the kingdom of heaven, if we but believe it to be so, and receive it truly with an open, willing, and generous heart. And may God bless you all.